Okay, so I guess we can start. So welcome everybody. So today we have Julia. We will talk about how much do small businesses rely on personal credit, and Manuel Adelino will discuss the paper. So Julia, you have like 40 minutes. Manuel, you will have 15 minutes. And so if you can keep your camera on during the talk. So if you have questions, so you can drop them in the chat, or you can raise your hand, and Julia will be happy to answer your questions. So some heads up about the next WEFI seminar. So it will be in 2 weeks. So we will have the student WEFI, and 4 PhD students / job market candidates in entrepreneurial finance will present their job market paper. So that's exciting. And so now it's time for Julia's seminar, and the floor is yours.
All right, thank you so much to the organizers for including the paper in the series, to Manuel for agreeing to discuss, and to all of you for being here. This is joint work with my colleague, Jialan Wang, so she's here as well. She'll be monitoring the chat if you want to ask any questions there, or feel free to interrupt me at any point as well. So, small business credit has contracted very sharply since the Great Recession. By some estimates, lending to small and medium enterprises declined by about 40% between 2008 and 2016. Now, small businesses are, of course, massively important for the US economy. They create 2 out of every 3 new jobs. So understandably, this has led to a lot of concerns about the possible consequences for economic activity. But one piece that's missing as we try to understand the consequences of a decline in small business credit for economic activity is the extent to which small business owners might be able to tap into other sources of credit. A good candidate here is personal credit, because over 90% of entrepreneurs report using personal scores to obtain credit for their business. And so this is a very nice piece of suggestive evidence of an important link between personal and business credit. But what we're still missing is, to what extent is personal credit able to replace declining business credit? So how quantitatively important is this substitution mechanism, and which entrepreneurs are able to tap into their personal credit lines as their supply of small business credit contracts? So this is what we're going to address in this paper. We're going to ask, to what extent do entrepreneurs make up for a negative business credit shock with their own personal credit lines? In a nutshell, we're going to exploit this sharp contraction in small business credit by large banks after 2008. And we're going to estimate the change in entrepreneurs' personal debt that resulted from that. So we're going to do that using this novel panel of linked personal and business credit records. So that's the Gies Consumer and Small Business Credit panel. We're going to exploit variation in the market share of top 4 banks. That's going to be the same identification strategy as in Chan, Hansen, and Stein, with the additional component that when we're trying to look at the change in entrepreneurs' personal debt, we're going to be comparing similar entrepreneurs and non-entrepreneurs in the same county. And what are we going to find? Well, we're going to start by documenting this large decline in small business lending by top 4 banks. This isn't new to our work. There's a growing body of work that documents this decline in small business credit. What's new to our work is showing that entrepreneurs increase their personal borrowing as a response to this. So to put numbers to this, we're going to find that a $1 decline in business credit is going to lead to an increase in personal credit of about 68 cents. So they're going to replace a very meaningful share of this decline in business credit with personal credit. We're also going to find that this is entirely driven by mortgage debt, specifically by cash out refis. And we're going to have some evidence that these entrepreneurs are indeed applying these funds toward their business. The way that we're going to show this is we're going to show that for entrepreneurs that do substitute for this declining business credit with personal credit, we're going to find no effect on their firm's financial distress. And that's unlike what we would expect from a large shock to firm borrowing. And finally, we're going to show that personal credit characteristics are key determinants of this substitution. This heterogeneity could not be starker. We're going to find that prime entrepreneurs are going to replace this lost business credit basically dollar for dollar. They're going to replace all of it. Whereas subprime entrepreneurs are going to replace none of it. So personal credit characteristics are going to be really important as we're trying to understand how important this substitution really is in practice. So this is related to a couple of different strands of literature, like the literature on housing collateral and entrepreneurship, on small business lending after the Great Recession, just more broadly on liquidity and credit constraints of entrepreneurs and personal credit information and self-employment. I don't have too much time to discuss this important work. I'll say that our contribution is going to mostly stem from the fact that, as far as we know, we're the first paper in this literature that's actually going to observe both the personal and the business credit records of these entrepreneurs, as well as their personal credit characteristics. So we're going to be able to shed light on this substitution from a quantitative standpoint. We're going to be able to say how meaningful this channel is and also who gets to tap into it. And so if there are no questions, I'm just going to segue right to discussing the data that we use in this paper. That's going to be the Gies Consumer and Small Business Credit Panel, or GCCP for short. At the core of the GCCP is a 1% sample of US borrowers with a credit report with Experian. So if you've ever looked at your credit report, that's basically the information that's going to show up in our data. It's going to include credit scores. It's going to include balances across all kinds of personal loans, such as mortgages, student loans, credit cards, etc. We're going to see payment history, so any delinquencies that consumers have, as well as public records and bankruptcies in particular, and some demographics as well, like age, gender, zip code, marital status, etc. Now, what's really different about the GCCP is that we are going to be able to link this by consumer ID to their business credit records if they have one. Okay, so for these roughly 2 to 3 million consumers per year that we're going to see, we're going to link in business credit records for those who are entrepreneurs. There's going to be about 8% of the sample, they're going to be entrepreneurs, and we're going to link in those records. So that's going to allow us to see these proprietary firm risk scores and all kinds of business credit, business loans as well, like term loans, credit lines, credit cards, leases. Also some payment history information, some public record information for firms, some information on UCC filings as well, and some demographics like firm age, ownership structure, number of employees, and some measures of revenue as well. Now, there's an entire other dimension to the GCCP that I'm not going to get to talk about today, and that is that we can also link these Experian credit reports by consumer ID to alternative credit records. So we're going to see things like payday loans and other types of subprime loans. I'm not going to talk at all about this today, but I have another paper using that dimension on the GCCP, so I encourage you to check that out if you're interested. But here's the data that we're going to be using for this paper, and here's how it's geographically distributed. These are just counts of borrowers on the left and all entrepreneurs on the right, just meant to show that this data is going to have national coverage of both consumers and entrepreneurs. And if you're thinking about what type of firm it is that we're seeing, well, in terms of their size as measured by their number of employees, they're going to look like a typical US firm. Okay, so what I'm showing you here is the fraction of businesses that falls under each of these employment size bins. And I'm comparing the counts in the GCCP, that's in light red, with census counts in red. And it looks like, you know, we have something that looks like a representative firm size distribution in this data. About 80% of these businesses are going to be non-employer firms, which is roughly the same as we see in the US as a whole. But where we're going to see a slightly different picture is when we look at credit balances themselves. So now I'm showing you the fraction of businesses that are going to fall under these bins of total business balance. And now I'm comparing the GCCP, still in light red, with the New York Fed's Small Business Credit Survey. And what we're finding is what looks like some underreporting in these small business records, which is very different than what we see on the personal side, where we believe we have pretty much complete coverage of this personal credit activity. That does not seem to be the case with these small business credit records. So as the goal of this project is really getting to that estimate of, when you get a $1 decline in small business credit, what is the increase in personal credit? This is something that we really need to do something about. So our approach in this paper is we're going to have to scale up these balances, and we're going to use the New York Fed's Small Business Credit Survey to do that. So how is that going to work? So consider a firm I in a characteristic group G. So you can think of a characteristic group as, say, a non-employer firm that is less than 2 years old. So what are we going to call the estimated total business debt for that firm? Well, we're going to take whatever we observe for that firm in the GCCP, and we're going to scale that up with a factor that we're going to construct for all firms that are non-employer and are less than 2 years old. So that factor is just going to be the average total business debt that we see in the Small Business Credit Survey for non-employer firms that are less than 2 years old, divided by the same average in the GCCP. So we're going to construct this kind of average underreporting for that characteristic group, and we're going to scale up all balances for all firms in that characteristic group by that same factor. Now, our baseline is going to be actually exactly what I just told you. A characteristic group is going to be employer status times 6 firm age bins. So it will really be something like a non-employer firm that's less than 2 years old. But for robustness, we are going to do everything else that we can. So we're going to take every characteristic that we can see in both the Small Business Credit Survey and the GCCP, and we're going to do this all possible ways. So all available crosstabs, we're going to do that. That's going to result in kind of a couple dozen other first stage estimates, and I'm going to show you all of them at once. Okay, so moving on to our empirical strategy. The variation that we're going to be exploiting is that contraction in small business lending after 2008. Now, why do we think that happened? There is a growing body of work that has studied the extent to which banks contracted their small business lending and why. And the consensus is that they were pulling back from small business lending to cope with losses after the Great Recession, and that this pattern was exacerbated by financial regulation after the crisis. And this decline was particularly pronounced among the largest banks. And so the variation that we're going to exploit is in the county level deposit share of top 4 banks in 2005. That's essentially the identification strategy in Chan, Hansen, and Stein. And that's the measure of market share of top 4 banks that we're going to be using. And we're going to be doing this in a diff and diff research design. The key assumption is going to be parallel trends, which I'll discuss a bit more later on. But here's our first stage. Our first stage is the effect of the top 4 bank share on business credit. So a unit of observation is going to be an entrepreneur I in county C in year T. And we're going to regress business credit for that entrepreneur on this top 4 measure. That's going to be the county level deposit share of top 4 banks in 2005. We're just going to interact that with time dummies, and we're going to show you how this effect evolves over time. In terms of controls, we're going to take the stand that around this time, we probably want to control for local house prices. But in robustness checks, we're going to show this result without controls or with many, many more controls. And we're going to add entrepreneur fixed effects. We're going to have county fixed effects and also year fixed effects in this first stage. So what about the reduced form? The reduced form is going to be the effect of the top 4 bank share on personal borrowing. That's not the interpretation we want to give it though. What we're looking for, the object that we're looking to estimate is that dollar elasticity of substitution between business credit and personal credit. We want to say for every $1 decline in business credit, there was an X dollar change in personal borrowing. That means we're going to pick up an assumption that's going to be akin to an exclusion restriction, right? We can't give this coefficient our preferred interpretation if the top 4 bank share has a direct effect on personal credit. So if you think about it for a little bit, this is a very strong assumption because the top 4 bank share might directly affect the supply of personal credit. For instance, as banks are pulling back from small business lending, they might be shifting into personal credit, or they might be pulling out of personal credit as well. And so we do not want to be in a position to defend this assumption. So what we're going to do instead is we're going to use non-entrepreneurs as a control group. That means we can replace this very strong assumption that the top 4 bank share doesn't affect the supply of personal credit with a considerably weaker assumption that to the extent that it does so similarly for entrepreneurs and non-entrepreneurs. Now, this is certainly a weaker assumption, but that doesn't mean that it's weak. In particular, one thing that's going to be kind of problematic for this assumption is that unconditionally non-entrepreneurs and entrepreneurs are very different. So what I'm showing you here on the left are just balances for the full sample of borrowers in red and also just for entrepreneurs in this lighter red. And this is showing you that entrepreneurs have more than twice as much personal debt. And that kind of carries over across all types of personal loans. And on the right, I'm showing you that, for instance, about 60% of entrepreneurs are prime borrowers compared to just 40% of all borrowers. They're also more likely to have a mortgage. They're less likely to be women, etc. Now, these are just differences in observables, but this is particularly tricky for what we're trying to do because when lenders are making decisions about how much to lend, they're going to do what's called a hard pull on your credit score. And what they're going to get is essentially going to be a snapshot of our data. So these are really the characteristics that lenders are using to underwrite these loans, except for a couple of them, like for instance, gender, which they might not be allowed to use. But these are really the characteristics that they're using to make decisions about credit supply. And because we know that personal credit markets are really segmented, it might be kind of problematic to make this assumption that, let's say, the top 4 bank share is going to affect the supply of credit to a prime borrower in the exact same way that it will affect the supply of credit to a subprime borrower. So what is going to be our approach for dealing with this? We're going to construct a matched sample of non-entrepreneurs that are going to look like entrepreneurs across a lot of these dimensions. So what we're going to match on is total consumer balances before 2009. So just this first column here on the plot to the left, all consumer balances, that's the variable we're matching on. And it turns out that makes these entrepreneurs and non-entrepreneurs similar across a very wide range of these characteristics. Exceptions are, of course, anything relating to business credit. That's by design, because the match controls are non-entrepreneurs. And another exception that you can see on the far right is gender. Only about 36% of entrepreneurs are women. And both unconditionally and in our sample of controls, that number is about 50%. We have a robustness check where we match for gender, and it really doesn't matter. It's actually surprising, to me at least, how unimportant gender seems to be to that substitution channel, but I don't think I'll have a ton of time to talk about this today. So our approach is going to be, we're going to match each entrepreneur with 2 non-entrepreneurs. They're going to be in the same county, so we're going to do an exact match in the first county where we observe the borrower. And we're also going to match on the level of personal debt prior to 2009 using a nearest neighbor algorithm. We're going to select the 2 closest controls. So what is this specification actually going to look like? we're now looking at an individual I in county C that's going to belong to this matched treated control group G in year T. And so we're going to regress a personal credit outcome for this entrepreneur on this, still the same top for bank share, the same time dummies, but now we're also going to interact this with this entrepreneur variable. That's a binary variable that's going to be 1 if the individual is an entrepreneur at any point in our sample, that's between 2009 and 2018. We're still going to be controlling for those house prices now interacted with the entrepreneur dummy. And we're really going to be saturating this with fixed effects. We're going to have individual fixed effects. We're going to have entrepreneur times year fixed effects. That means the entrepreneur dummy. And so this is going to pick up any trends in personal credit that are common to all entrepreneurs. That's going to absorb that variation. We're going to have match year fixed effects and also county year fixed effects. So these entrepreneurs are going to generally be exposed to the same, these entrepreneurs and non-entrepreneurs are going to be exposed to the same local economic conditions. And so again, our goal is saying for every $1 decline in small business credit, what is the effect on personal credit? So we want to scale this reduced form by the first stage, essentially. We're going to scale the effect on consumer credit by the effect on business credit. Our approach to doing this is we're going to jointly estimate the first stage and the reduced form using seemingly unrelated regression. And we're going to compute standard errors for this ratio using the delta method. All right, so let me get started with my results. I'll just highlight that, our key assumption here is not that entrepreneurship is randomly assigned. It's that these outcomes for treated and control would have evolved in close parallel absent the credit shock. The main way we're going to test for this is I'm going to show you that these personal credit outcomes did evolve in parallel prior to the shock. Okay, but let me start with the effect on business credit on personal borrowing, starting with the first stage, which is the effect of the top 4 share on small business credit. So our baseline estimate is in red. And what this is showing us in the pull estimate is an entrepreneur in a county with 100% top 4 share is going to experience a decline in business credit of $13,572 relative to an entrepreneur in a county with no top 4 bank presence. What are these gray lines that I'm also showing in addition to our baseline in red? Well, I promised that I would show you basically every single way that we can scale these business balances using the Small Business Credit Survey. So here they are, kind of a couple of different ways to do this. These are the gray lines, and you're going to see that they're mostly going to fall within our confidence intervals. Possible exception is there towards the end. So it looks like our baseline scaling procedure is potentially making us overstate the extent to which this effect in small business credit is rebounding by 2018. So this is something that we're thinking about, but kind of overall, we're finding that this is at least kind of lining up with our confidence intervals. And so the reduced form is again going to be what is the effect of that top 4 share on personal credit. And now this is not only comparing counties with 100% top 4 share with counties that have no top 4 bank presence. Now we're also comparing entrepreneurs and non-entrepreneurs. So what we're going to find in the polled estimate is that entrepreneurs are going to increase their personal borrowing by about $9,178 relative to non-entrepreneurs. Or once we scale basically this coefficient by the coefficient in the last slide, we're going to have that a $1 decline in business credit is going to lead to an increase in personal credit of about 68 cents, which is significant at 5%. Okay, so we're going to find that these entrepreneurs are meaningfully, but not fully substituting for this decline in small business credit with personal borrowing. Now, what we're going to find is that this effect is entirely driven by mortgage loans. It looks like I accidentally plotted the same thing twice. I did not. It is really that the entirety of the effect on balances is driven by mortgage loans. Okay, we also look at other credit categories like credit cards, and we don't find an effect there. And so the next thing that we want to convince you of is that these are cash out refis and not, say, entrepreneurs buying their first homes or moving into larger homes. So how are we going to do that? A couple different ways. Starting with, we're going to use the fact that we actually have this data at the loan level, and we're going to have an algorithm to identify a refi. That algorithm is basically going to flag instances where one mortgage is closed, another one is open in very short succession. So within a 30-day window, you're closing a mortgage or opening another one. We're going to call that a refi. We're then going to aggregate those balances back to the consumer level, and I'm going to subtract them from this total mortgage loan balance right there. So I'm going to show you what this looks like when you take out these cash out refi balances from total mortgage loans. And here what it looks like. We really see nothing there once we exclude what we categorize as refis. But since this is kind of our own algorithm that we're using to exclude these refis, you might be worried, what if you're also picking up moving, and you're calling that a refi because they're opening and closing a mortgage and this kind of very short time frame. While it would be unusual for someone who's moving to be able to do that within 30 days, what we do is we actually look at moving. So since we have the zip code of the consumer, we can at least look at whether they're moving to another zip code. And we find that they're, if anything, slightly less likely to move relative to non-entrepreneurs. That is, of course, not consistent with moving to another house. It is consistent with having a little bit less equity in your home. Okay, so we put kind of all of this evidence together. We have a couple other things in the paper as well. And we think that this is convincing evidence that they're extracting equity from their homes as opposed to buying new homes or just moving. Okay, and so the last thing that I want to talk about is this heterogeneity component of our results, which is basically, I think by now we've answered the question of to what extent do entrepreneurs rely on personal borrowing? And the next thing that we want to do is we want to say which entrepreneurs do that. And we're going to find that it is really going to depend on the personal credit characteristics of entrepreneurs. So what I'm showing you now is our main results, but broken down by whether the entrepreneur is a subprime or non-prime, that's the light red lines, or if they're prime or super prime, that's the dark red. Okay, so what we can see is, well, it's true that firms that are owned by entrepreneurs that are prime, they're going to experience a much larger decline in small business credit, but they're actually going to replace all of it with personal credit. It's maybe not super easy to see this from just eyeballing these two plots, but the coefficient is going to be close to 1 here. The same is not true for subprime entrepreneurs. They're actually not going to be replacing lost business credit with personal credit, even though they actually have a smaller shock. So a smaller amount that they would have to replace in the first place, they're still not doing that. Okay, so subprime entrepreneurs are going to basically replace none of the shock with their personal credit lines. And we're going to find similar patterns when we look at other financial or personal credit characteristics. So for instance, here is income. We have a measure of income in these data as well. So we can also split these entrepreneurs by high income in dark red and low income in light red. And we're going to see kind of similar patterns. High income entrepreneurs are getting hit with a larger shock, possibly because they have larger firms to begin with, but they're replacing the shock basically dollar for dollar, whereas you're seeing nothing on the personal borrowing of these low income entrepreneurs. And we're seeing something similar as well if you look at other personal credit characteristics like balance to limit ratio, for instance. So now we're splitting these entrepreneurs by whether they have high credit card usage in light red or low usage in dark red, where low usage is going to be viewed as a more creditworthy borrower if they're not kind of maxed out on their credit cards. And again, we're seeing that, low usage entrepreneurs are replacing all of the shock, high usage entrepreneurs are replacing none of it. So we're finding that these personal credit characteristics are basically perfectly predicting this heterogeneity. They're perfectly predicting who taps into their personal credit lines when they're hit with this negative business credit shock. And so the last result that I want to talk about is some evidence that these funds are being applied toward these businesses. What I would like to show you is this money actually flowing into these firms, or a very direct outcome for these firms, like, for instance, investment. We unfortunately don't see that. So we're going to try to get at this in a very indirect way. So we're going to use the fact that prior work has shown that following negative business credit shocks, firms tend to experience financial distress. And so we're going to look at whether firms in our sample are experiencing financial distress following this very large small business credit shock. And we're also going to look at the heterogeneity across firms here as well. And what we're going to look at two different measures of financial distress. In the first three columns, we have a binary variable for whether the firm has any delinquency in their small business loans. And in the following three columns, we have that proprietary firm risk score measure. And what we're finding is that only firms owned by subprime entrepreneurs, they're the ones who don't substitute at all, are experiencing financial distress. So they're more likely to have a business delinquency, and there's a decline in their firm's risk scores. So only entrepreneurs who don't substitute are seeing that impact in measures of firm financial distress, which we think is at least consistent with the idea that they're actually applying these funds toward their businesses, and not, for instance, using it to consume or save or do something else. Okay, so in terms of robustness checks, we check that our effect isn't driven by a couple different things, like the characteristics that we use in our scaling procedure. We varied the matching criteria, the number of controls. We controlled for a lot of pre-shock level differences and variables relating to economic conditions. And I guess I showed you that the increase in mortgage debt is not driven by moving or first-time home buying, or at least I showed you some of this evidence. We have a bit more in the paper. And the other thing that we do is, in case any of you were worried that maybe these personal credit characteristics are just proxying for firm characteristics. So maybe subprime borrowers have firms that are smaller or younger or something like that. We actually horse race these splits by personal credit characteristics. We horse race them against firm characteristics, and we find that they're not driven by that at all. Okay, so let me conclude a few minutes early. So we studied the substitution to personal credit after a negative business credit shock. We're basically exploiting this contraction in small business lending by large banks after 2008. We find that personal credit makes up for most, but not all, of this decline in small business lending. And we find that this is driven by mortgages with no effect on credit cards. And so the other kind of big picture implication of this work, in our view, is the fact that these personal credit characteristics are really important determinants of the substitution coefficient. To me, that says that if you're just looking at firm level measures, you're missing an important part of what determine the overall access to external finance of these businesses. And unless you think that something like your credit score is a perfect predictor of the quality of your business, not a good predictor, a perfect predictor of the quality of your business, then that would suggest that there's maybe some capital misallocation happening, since it's really only prime entrepreneurs that are tapping into that personal credit once they're hit with a negative business credit shock. All right, so that is all that I have. Happy to use those additional 5 minutes for some extra Q&A if anyone have questions. If not, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Julia, for this excellent presentation. So I see a couple of questions in the chat. So do the people who ask the question want to raise their hand and ask Julia the question directly?
Yeah, maybe Mark can go over his last more detailed comment if we have a few extra minutes.
Okay, great. Yeah, so I think there's a couple of different things going on. So like as I mentioned in the last point, you guys largely talk about quantities, right? So the amount of dollars moving around, and I think that's first order interesting. I think the other thing that's worth looking at is the prices, right? So during that time, I was actually an entrepreneur. I ran a private equity firm and, was struggling with finding financing from large banks. JP Morgan Chase basically told us to go pound sand, even though we had a 20-year relationship with them. And so I think one of the interesting things was, gosh, look, mortgage rates are super cheap. I can essentially supplement, existing debt, or essentially just, take my loan out from JP Morgan Chase that's running me up from, charging me prime to, prime plus 200 basis points. And so I think if you can essentially say something about how the prices, essentially the interest rates, drove some of this effect would be super interesting as well to add to the paper. And I think the second thing that's worth looking at is the source of the credit, secured versus unsecured lending on the company side, and then also on the borrower side, right? So smaller firms are known to rely on asset-based lending, secured lending, versus larger companies tend to rely more on, cash flow-based lending. And the interesting twist here is that consumers also rely on asset-based lending and cash flow-based lending. And so the interesting thing to disentangle here is like how much of this is, a substitute, like is it asset-based lending for asset-based lending, or perhaps is it because consumers can essentially provide cash flow-based lending that's secured in some sense, right? Like if you have a small company and you say, hey, look, we have plenty of cash flows, but then you fold up the tent and, the bank is like, essentially chasing money that isn't there because you just start up another company. But if you guarantee it on a personal level, the income that you're guaranteeing, you can't really run away from it, right? So to the extent that you provide a personal guarantee, the bank has not just physical collateral, but they essentially seize your wages, put you into bankruptcy, et cetera, right? So it's a much more powerful hammer on the personal side. And so I think there's some interesting things that you could potentially address on that side if they're not already in the paper.
No, that's right. I think it would be really interesting if we could look at prices as well. That's also really important. So prior works on this, business credit dynamics after the Great Recession, they've shown that interest rates are going up for firms around this time. We don't actually observe interest rates on the business side. We do have some measure of it on the consumer side. So we would be able to tell you what's happening with rates on the consumer side, not necessarily on the business side. In terms of secured versus unsecured, I mean, you're right that the vast majority of small business credit is going to be secured. So we are really trading off kind of asset-backed credit for asset-backed credit because we show that on the personal side, that's also secured. But it's true that there is this issue of potentially limited liability on the business side. And so it could be that the answer to why these banks are even willing to lend to these entrepreneurs on the personal side is precisely because now you're getting this additional layer of personal guarantees. And I agree. I think that it might be an important determinant of what's going on.
So I think there's one other thing at play that might actually be working against your results. So in fact, I think your results may in fact be stronger if the mechanism is different from just a flight to quality, right? So the other thing that happened was the amount of securitization that occurred for cash flow based lending versus asset based lending changed dramatically. So before the financial crisis, there was a lot of securitization to cash flow based lending, credit cards, and so on, and that completely dried up. Right. And so to the extent that banks aren't able to offload these types of risks off their balance sheet, right, we also saw that particularly the sort of sketchy loans that were made, prior to the financial crisis didn't perform particularly well, and the financial markets were much more interested in asset-based lending because essentially you could verify the collateral as opposed to somebody claiming that had plenty of income, right? And so the thing I'm kind of left with is the fact that it didn't bounce back completely suggests perhaps there's sort of a fundamental change in the markets, and if you look at the securitization even out to today, cash flow based lending, securitization has not bounced back. And so there's a possibility, in fact, that part of the reason that it hasn't come back all the way on the business side is this reliance on asset-based lending, right? And so that may be something to sort of tease out and maybe think about a bit more carefully.
Thank you very much. Maybe let's hear what Manuel has to say about the paper, and then we can continue, this very interesting discussion afterwards.
All right, thank you. I'm not able to share right now.
Oh, I think it's because I was sharing. I'm sorry.
No, I can't. No, good. Thank you. Yeah, so thanks for giving me the opportunity to discuss this paper. It's a very nice paper. Okay. So as you heard from Julia, and I won't repeat all of what the paper is doing, really the question over here is, at least how I interpret it, is how much do business owners distinguish their personal and their business balance sheets? And I have to say that my prior on this is that at the small end of the spectrum, they don't really much. And so in a sense, I was coming to the paper with a very favorable view to begin with. And I think the paper provides very useful and very convincing evidence that that this is the case. So small business owners do substitute business credit for personal credit, and they do this primarily in the form of mortgages. And I think we had evidence from, that indeed mortgages are used to start businesses, and here it's a literal substitution between business credit and personal credit. And the empirical work is very clean and I think very convincing in this respect. They use the large bank share. I have a little bit to say about the large bank share and what exactly that's moving around. But essentially, they're using the fact that the large bank share contracted the supply of credit to small businesses, and then look at what is happening on the personal side. So that's intuitive and clean. And then I'll come back to the heterogeneity results at the very end, and this issue of substitution, and the fact that the substitution is easier for the higher credit score, high income owners. I don't think that's obvious, or at least I don't, it's not obvious to me what we should draw from that. And some of it has to do precisely with sort of asset-based lending, and whether we sort of how we should interpret the fact that substitution was easier with this shock for the high credit score borrowers. And I really only have 2 or 3 comments. So the first one is the scaling, okay? And of course, I think Julia and Jialan are very, very aware of this issue. When you compare their data to census data, the numbers of firms look very similar. The counts and amounts of loans look very different. And so you're going to have many, many more firms that have no debt. You're going to, relative to the truth, let's call SBCS here, as I'm going to call it, ground truth, sort of census data. You have many, many more firms that don't have debt. And then you have many fewer firms with small loans. And at least in this graph, almost nobody with large loans. I know that's not true. There's some, but very few relative to what is true in census. Now, this is a cheap shot in the sense that, does it matter? If as long as we can recover the truth from the variation in this data, the way to think about this is now, okay, so I have this in the cross section and it looks very different in the cross section. But if I use variation, am I getting something that is close to the true variation? That's the issue, right? And so it really only matters if it's going to lead you to the wrong conclusions for this particular question. So this is not to say, oh, the data looks different. Sure, the data looks different from the truth, but it's a sample. As long as it's a representative sample and the variation within each cell looks fine, there's no reason not to use it. And in fact, it's perfectly fine. One issue that I do have over here is, to what extent is the variation in large loans more mismeasured? So if I have these very large loans that I almost don't see, and then I have some small loans that I do see. Does now substitution look bigger? And what I mean by that, I'll again also return to this. I can't do a cash out refi to substitute $300,000. Almost nobody has $300,000 in equity in their homes. Certainly nobody has $2 million in equity in their homes. And so if my $2 million loan is cut, I can't replace it with a cash out refi. And so is it the case that by having better measurement and more variation in the 0 to 25,000, it looks like people can substitute very easily, but that's because I can get $20,000 cash out refis. Again, I cannot get, I mean, you can't even get 100,000 really for 99% of the population, let alone $1 million. So is there any evidence? And maybe here I would look at the kinds of loans that are being cut or the kind of credit that's being cut. And does substitution look similar? I don't think you would want to see a very high substitution numbers for $1 million loans. You probably will see them for the smaller loans. And it's not intended as a cheap shot. Just, oh, the data looks different from the truth. That's fine. As long as I said, as long as the variation looks true to the ground truth, then it's fine. But you might be getting substitution numbers that look really large just because of the stuff that you can measure. My second point is the scaling factors that are used are primarily based on age, if I understood correctly. Or like age seems to be the main firm level category. It didn't look to me that the scaling factors vary much by age. They're like always about 20% or always about 13% for all age categories. So, you know, there's a little bit of variation, but it's not like age is something that really separates this cross section, as far as I could tell, in terms of these adjustment factors. It discriminates a little bit, you know, 22 to 16, 12 to 13. It's not producing this really dramatic cross section. If at all possible to use size, I would. I know you can't, or probably can't. That's why you didn't do it. But anything else that would improve on these scaling factors would be really, really nice. Age, I see that you would use age because you can see age. It doesn't seem super powerful in generating and separating quite the way you would like. The second question, this is a big comment that I have. I don't think, at least in the version, unless I missed it, I'm not sure that this paper is cited. Am I being unfair? Is the D'Acunto Rossi paper cited? I don't think so, but maybe I missed it. So D'Acunto and Rossi is 2022 RFS paper that shows that there's a very dramatic difference in what happened to mortgages, small mortgages and big mortgages exactly around this time. So essentially small mortgages dropped. There were fewer small mortgages being made, and there were more large mortgages being made. The reason why this matters really crucially for your paper is that this is all driven by top 5 banks. So essentially using the identical variation to what you have, there is the top 5 banks are cutting small loans and increasing large loans. And below the top 5, they are reducing small loans by less and increasing large loans by less. So the top 5 banks, which is exactly the source of variation that you're using, dramatically changed the way they were giving out mortgages. And so it's not just that, you know, that there's sort of a hypothetical that they might have, they did. And so I think it is a challenge to identification to understand. And again, I understand that you match entrepreneurs with non-entrepreneurs, but entrepreneurs are different and might unobservably look better. And then the issue that I think comes up is what comes first. Is it, and in fact, to me, you convincingly show the substitution. It wasn't obvious to me if what's happening is large banks are cutting business loans and people are substituting, or mortgage terms are becoming more attractive in relative terms. And so I prefer to borrow on my house than to borrow on my business. And so the decision goes in reverse. I'd rather have a cash out refi because it's cheaper and I'm going to pay back the business loan. And then who does it? the prime borrowers, because they're the ones, exactly in this top four split, they're the ones for whom the large loans became more attractive, because we know that large banks were making more large mortgages. I think it's actually very hard to disentangle. And maybe it doesn't matter. It's still your story. It's still about the balance sheets being blended. But it could well be that the business owner realizes that it's cheaper to borrow on the house than to borrow against the firm. And so, and maybe this, and obviously the non-entrepreneurs are not going to do it because they don't have any firms, but the entrepreneurs do have a reason to substitute, and then they substitute. Again, it's still substitution. It's still blended household balance sheets with firm balance sheets, but it goes from household to firm rather than from firm to household. There wasn't any test in the paper that convinced me that this wasn't the case. Okay. Remember also that given that it's the prime people for whom this is happening the most, there should be a story for why business loans for prime people are cut by more. And what my story would say is, well, the mortgages became more attractive for prime people, and so they're the ones that substitute more, because they're the ones that can do it. They're the ones for whom the cash out became cheaper. Again, I don't know. It's hard. I think it's hard to disentangle, but I'm sure you were very creative with all other challenges, so you will find a way to disentangle this one as well. Again, the current results, and this is an interpretation issue, and I may be running out of time, although I started very late, but I'll shut up in a second. The current results, in a sense, tell me, if I take the results at face value, they tell me the prime balance sheets are more blended with the firm than the subprime balance sheets, meaning a prime owner distinguishes their balance sheet less from the firm than a subprime owner. That's surprising to me in a sense. I think theoretically I would expect the reverse. In particular, if I'm a subprime owner, I think it's more likely that that collateral is more valuable to me. And so to the extent that the collateral that I have available is my home, and that my firm, because most of my assets are rented, provides poor collateral, then I would expect the subprime borrower to have a stronger incentive to blend the balance sheets. And I just encourage more discussion of this. So who should, a priori, who should make this distinction more stark and less stark? And to me, I think at least some mechanisms would lead the subprime guy to want to borrow against the home more so than the prime guy. And your results are telling me, no, it's actually the prime guy that has this balance sheet that's not distinguished from the firm. Again, I think if the prime people are running larger businesses, then again, it's harder to substitute just because the lending requirements are bigger. I don't know. These are just hypotheses out there, but I'd like to understand if I should expect the primes to be more distinguishing their balance sheets less. Last point is I'll send you this separately because I know I'm out of time. I thought it was a very nice paper on the debt management of small business owners, very consistent with my priors, but we didn't have direct evidence of this degree of substitution. So I think it's a very, very nice paper in this respect. I would say there's a little bit of margin for improvement, maybe on the measurement of debt, maybe especially these large categories, and tightening this interpretation of the source of changes. Is it household to firm or is it firm to household? And what should I expect? Should I expect the prime people or the subprime people to put more value on borrowing against their homes? And that's it. Thank you.